Last month, I uploaded a video talking about some of the good things about the 1920s, and now I want to balance that out with a list of some of the bad things. For me, the most glaring issue with the 1920s was global instability. Sure, not every single country was directly affected by this, but it was widespread. World War I had caused chaos throughout the world, then caused even more after it ended. Monarchies and empires had been destroyed, leaving gaping power vacuums and a lot of vulnerable people. The list of conflicts in the world in the late 1910s and early 1920s is staggering. One of the biggest and most consequential ones was the Russian Civil War that followed the Bolshevik Revolution. This war left about 2 million people dead and dragged a slew of other countries into the fray. And if that wasn't bad enough, Russia also got involved in a war with Poland, ending in 1921, that killed tens of thousands more. Then, of course, there was the Irish Revolution, which began in 1917 and ended in 1921, and then the ensuing Civil War that lasted until 1923. While the casualties were far less than many other conflicts at that time, it was still a major instability on the soil of one of the most developed countries in the world, at a time when revolutions could prove devastating if they got out of control. There were more wars involving Turkey, after the Ottoman Empire had fallen with the end of World War I. Turkish forces clashed with Greek, Armenian, and French forces, and also had plenty of domestic troubles as well. There were also some major conflicts that are now virtually forgotten, like the Rif War between Spanish and French troops and Berber tribes of northern Morocco. And then there was the Cristero War in Mexico, which was an internal conflict over Catholicism and the law. Really, the list can go on, but I think I've made my point. There have been few decades as volatile and politically unstable on a global scale as the 1920s. This, of course, excluding the decades that contained the two world wars. I've made this comparison before, but the 1920s were quite similar to the 1950s in this way. Both were after a world war, and massive power vacuums had been created, and chaos ensued around the world. It's a bit interesting, though, that both decades are thought of so highly overall in America, while they're known for their violence and turbulence in so many other countries. Of course, there are reasons for that, but that's for another time. The 1920s also saw the rise of some of the most notorious figures in modern history. Adolf Hitler attempted a coup in 1923, got arrested and wrote Mein Kampf in prison, then was released, ready to continue his journey to create the Third Reich, now with a powerful mythology that he had built around himself. Joseph Stalin became General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1922, and really consolidated his power after the death of Vladimir Lenin. In the late 1920s, he masterminded a mass terror campaign in the countryside. Benito Mussolini and his fascist followers marched on Rome in 1922, and successfully pressured King Emmanuel III into appointing him as Prime Minister. Mao Zedong also became a top leader in the fairly small Communist Party in China during this time. And the Imperial Japanese Army began to run amok in Manchuria, especially in the late 1920s. In 1928, it clashed with Chinese nationalist soldiers in Shandong, which eventually led to thousands of deaths, the vast majority of losses being Chinese. That same year, the Japanese army assassinated a Chinese warlord. As alarming as these things were at the time, hindsight makes them far worse, since we know that they directly led to some of the most horrific atrocities in history. And while the US mostly stayed away from international conflicts in the 1920s, it still struggled with racial injustice and racial violence domestically. In the summer of 1919, there had been major so-called race riots in many cities around the country, setting the stage for more in the 1920s. The most notorious of these was the Tulsa Massacre in 1921. This event often stands as the representation of 1920s racism in many Americans' minds now. The official number of dead in 1921 was listed as 36, but it is now believed to have been much higher, possibly even exceeding 150, and hundreds more were injured. There were also 2 similar eruptions of racially charged violence in Florida, in Ocoee in 1920 and Rosewood in 1923. Combined, they left dozens more dead. Additionally, there were more than 300 lynchings around the country in the 1920s, most occurring in southern states, but some in other states as well, including an infamous triple lynching in Duluth, Minnesota in 1920. There was also some violence and discrimination toward other minority groups as well, which was part of a general xenophobia that permeated the US. Prejudice toward Italian immigrants is symbolized by the Sacco and Vanzetti murder trial. Whether or not they were innocent or guilty of the murder they were accused of committing, it is often argued that they were treated unfairly based on their foreign origins. This is because, at the time, Italian immigrants were often associated with anarchists, some of which carried out terrorist attacks. In the end, Sacco and Vanzetti were imprisoned for a number of years before finally being executed in 1927. There were a lot of strong opinions for and against the 2 men, and, if anything, the case revealed that anti-Italian prejudice did exist in America. But it doesn't end there. In Yakima, Washington in 1927, many Filipinos in the area were threatened, beaten, and driven out of town. There was also another incident involving Filipinos, who were on strike in Hawaii, and 16 of them were killed by the police, with 4 police officers also dying in the process. And, of course, there was the KKK. The group hit record membership numbers in the middle years of the decade, possibly getting as high as 8 million. They didn't just harass black people, they were against pretty much all minorities, including religious minorities, especially Catholics and Jews. The good news is that their membership took a nosedive shortly after peaking, and their influence decreased along with it. There were also other incidents of violence not related to race. In 1922, in Herrin, Illinois, striking mine workers clashed with strikebreakers, resulting in 23 people being killed. The Wall Street bombing in 1920 killed 40 people in an act of domestic terrorism. And perhaps most horrific, a man blew up a school in Bath, Michigan in 1927, killing 45 people, most of them being children. Then there was the Immigration Act of 1924. This law set conservative limits on immigration based on the immigrant's country of origin. It was especially exclusive toward Japanese immigrants, barring them outright, causing diplomatic tensions with Japan, who at the time was attempting to be seen as an equal of the powerful Western nations. And the Immigration Act of 1924 didn't change the already existing Chinese Exclusion Act, which also banned Chinese immigrants outright. While there were workarounds to this pre-existing law, it says something that it was still kept in effect. President Calvin Coolidge, though opposing the stricter elements of the Immigration Act, signed it into law anyway when a compromise couldn't be reached. The Immigration Act of 1924 hadn't come from nowhere, though. The earlier Emergency Quota Act had been passed into law in 1921 during the Harding administration. California also had the Alien Land Law of 1920, which was specifically intended to prohibit Japanese immigrants from owning farmland in the state. And some other states had similar laws. In a related note, far-left groups were targeted for persecution by government officials, more specifically Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer and J. Edgar Hoover. Palmer had placed Hoover as the head of the General Intelligence Division, which was part of the Bureau of Investigation. J. Edgar Hoover strong-armed Department of Labor officials for warrants to arrest immigrants based solely on membership in or affiliation with groups associated with communism, even if they were non-radical groups. This was the tail end of the first Red Scare, which continued into 1920. Numerous raids were conducted in January and February 1920, and many immigrants were deported, including some leftist leaders. At the time, news coverage was mostly positive in the mainstream outlets. But the fact remains that despite what you may think about the politics of those arrested, many of their arrests were unlawful. And actually, the American Civil Liberties Union was established in January 1920 to fight against these rights violations. Also in early 1920, 5 socialist members of the New York State Assembly were first suspended, then expelled, based pretty much entirely on their affiliation with leftist politics. Though this decision was opposed by both Republicans and Democrats, such as Supreme Court Justice Charles Evans Hughes and New York Governor Al Smith. The intensity of the first Red Scare pretty much died down by May 1920, but it started off the 1920s rather badly. As many Americans well know, Prohibition still stands as one of the most visible legacies of the 1920s in the US, and it is almost universally regarded as a failure. But it didn't just fail, it caused a whole load of new problems as well. A lot of average people didn't treat a federal law seriously, which made it look like the federal government couldn't successfully follow through on a major policy. And people who normally wouldn't have engaged in criminal activities became involved in something with links to organized crime and other illegal activities like making moonshine and bootlegging. In order to deter people from drinking illegal alcohol, the government intentionally poisoned industrial alcohol with methanol, which could prove fatal when consumed, as well as some other poisons. They chose industrial alcohol because it was often stolen or otherwise obtained for use in illegal alcohol production. The government also attempted to make the alcohol simply taste bad rather than cause severe sickness, but the poisoning method understandably gets more attention. Another problem Prohibition caused was another unfortunate symbol of the decade: gangsters. It seems like many people in recent times like to glorify 1920s gangsters in a way, but they were often violent and ruthless. Of course, gangs and thugs existed long before Prohibition began, but it gave them a profitable trade which granted them considerably more power and influence over society. Illegal alcohol production and transportation was a very lucrative market, and where there is a lot of money involved, violence often follows. Most of this violence was directed not at normal people, but at members of other gangs, as evidenced in the Valentine's Day Massacre in February 1929, but it still wasn't really a good thing. This new industry attracted plenty of young men wanting to get rich at the expense of a poorly thought out law, but they often got wrapped up in some messy business in the process. In America, one of the most enduring symbols of government corruption is the Teapot Dome scandal. It was perhaps the most notorious political scandal in the US until the Watergate scandal 50 years later. It involved some of President Warren G. Harding's cabinet members. Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall leased out an oil field in Wyoming that was designated for naval oil reserves to a private oil company. Not only that, but it was done secretly under the table with bribes, and Secretary Fall profited financially from the deal. But the Teapot Dome oil field wasn't the only one involved. Fall made similar deals for 2 other oil fields in California. Fall's guilt was eventually proven, and he served 9 months of his 1-year prison sentence. Another Harding cabinet member also proved to be very problematic as well. That was Attorney General Harry Daugherty. Under Daugherty's supervision, some of his aides exchanged bribes for special favors, which included appointments, prison pardons, and to avoid prosecution. And many of these special favors were bought by bootleggers, people who were blatantly breaking the federal prohibition law. Daugherty was also thought to be involved in the Teapot Dome scandal, more specifically that he learned about the shady dealings and did nothing to stop them. But he was never convicted of anything related to the scandal. One of Daugherty's aides ended up shooting himself, supposedly, though it was also alleged that he was murdered. Daugherty escaped jail time, but later resigned his post in the Coolidge administration under immense pressure from almost everyone in the government. But wait, there's more. There was yet another scandal involving Charles Forbes, the director of the newly created Veterans Bureau. Forbes intentionally overcharged the government for the construction of veterans' hospitals and pocketed the difference. He also accepted bribes and sold federal hospital supplies at a discount in private deals. He was eventually found guilty and convicted, and sentenced to 2 years in prison. President Harding died just as some of these scandals were becoming known, and he was not happy about the initial reports. Harding's role is still debated, ranging from some involvement to simply being overly trusting of untrustworthy people and negligent. And as I think everyone knows, the 1920s ended with a bang. The infamous stock market crash and the ensuing economic shocks in late October 1929 really signaled the end of an era of reckless spending and speculating. The worst effects of the following economic depression would be seen a couple of years after the crash, but anyone who had been doing a lot of trading in the stock market would have felt the immediate effects. For those people, the feeling of not only losing so much money, but also feeling utterly betrayed by a system they thought was sound, must have been a very miserable experience. Compared to the other things I've talked about so far, this next one will probably seem a bit less horrible, and I'm going to go more into editorial mode for a bit. Personally, I don't like the sensationalism of the 1920s. Don't get me wrong, that's part of what makes it so interesting to research, but if I was alive back then, it would probably just be really annoying to me. The 1920s had a crazy amount of so-called trials of the century. These included the Sacco and Vanzetti trial in 1920, the Fatty Arbuckle trial in 1921, the Black Sox trial in 1921, the Leopold and Loeb trial in 1924, the Scopes Monkey trial in 1925, and the Halls Mills trial in 1926. Of course, normal coverage of these trials was perfectly warranted, but it often became over the top, especially with the murder trials. And I'm not saying that the current day and age is morally superior, since the same thing happens now, but it just seemed more concentrated in the 1920s. And this was also around the time that this sort of thing became more normalized. The 1920s also saw the aggressive use of psychology for advertising or public relations, as pioneered by Edward Bernays. As interesting and ingenious as he was, I personally find a lot of his tactics and use of psychology to sway people to be distasteful, even if it was very modern. But that's just my opinion. Not every campaign he did was ethically questionable, but one of his most famous ones was convincing young women to smoke cigarettes by connecting them with the increased freedom for women going on at the time. So yeah, that one did not age well at all. And I recently found these ads from Prudential Life Insurance from the 1920s that are pretty messed up, and I didn't know where else to put them, so I'll just throw them in here. Every decade has ads that cross a line or two, so I can't hold it against the 1920s too much, but check out how aggressive these scare tactics are. They show widows, elderly women, and orphaned children, among others, suffering because the man of the family hadn't bought life insurance before he died. So yeah, that's pretty dark and exploitative. So I think I covered most of the main points that really stick out to me. But what do you think? Did I leave something big out? Did you disagree with any of my points? Let me know in the comments. And I just want to use this time to say that it's okay to enjoy something about the past, but it's also important to acknowledge that there were problems, some of them very serious problems. When it comes to the 1920s and other times in the past, people often seem very divided. Some think it was some kind of wonderland when everything was better, and others condemn virtually everyone living at that time as terrible and that everything was so bad. On this channel, I always try to include both the good things and the bad things about the 1920s, and I hope that these two companion videos convince some people who hate everything about the 1920s that there were some good things too, and teaches someone who is blindly loyal to the perceived greatness of the 1920s that it was far from perfect. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.